Breakups are always a hard thing to go through, where when you think you had a good relationship or wanted one, things always don't manage to work out. And sometimes to remedy those feelings, there are movies out there that touch upon such subjects that relate to the story to the creators in one way or another. But in this case, I'm not talking about those types of romantical or breakup movies that you might be thinking about, obviously since you did click on the title of this video, where instead I'm actually referring to a Marvel movie in Captain America Civil War, the ultimate Marvel breakup movie. Because it's in fact the one movie that tore the Avengers apart, where they were no longer a valid team by the end of the film, and its effects that spilled over into Infinity War, where after reviewing such a great movie for such a unified villain for those like Thanos that accomplished his mission, I indeed had to go back to truly praise Civil War for what it did to get to this point. What would be in fact the last great Captain America movie since Brave New World came out. I mean, I really do like the ideas of Sam Wilson's version of Captain America and still root for him in some way, but not what they did for him in that movie and what has been displayed by him ever since, which is not particularly great in my opinion. In fact, I'll just say that I think that movie is complete trash and that it took so long to solve the problems that the Eternals created a few years prior. But in the spirit of a good season, I wanted to just refocus the attention on the good releases instead of the bad that most people usually would say when a new Marvel project is released. Where at least the last two films in Thunderbolts and Fantastic Four in 2025 are actually good in my opinion. But going back to Civil War being the breakup movie is where I truly meant that with that story and the events that make it emotional as a rom-com or a drama that usually involves such heartbreaking topics over a bunch of heroes that we love. The events of Civil War also come shortly after the Age of Ultron, whose ending saw a newer group of heroes join the Avengers after what happened in Sokovia, building towards a bigger universe and a bigger team with other comic heroes many grew up loving, and also coming off the introduction of characters like Ant-Man, where this time it only felt right that individual character movies would involve more heroes compared to the past of how the MCU started out, where they would just be small side ones or lower scaled people appearing and connecting to the events before the big films played out. Because as we could see in this film, despite it clearly focusing on the main hero of Captain America himself, it has most of the Avengers in it, with Iron Man taking a co-lead role in this film after his entire trilogy of films that was complete 3 years earlier, and became more of a father figure to the rest of the modern heroes and a friend of Steve. It was a unique case since it was named a Captain America movie and not an Avengers movie, mostly for the fact that it still followed up from the Winter Soldier and the events of that previous film, and Steve and Bucky's story in that aspect, but how it's also the other fact that not all the Avengers appear in this film, namely Bruce and Thor, which contributes to another reason why it can't be an Avengers movie, and how they are also separated in Thor Ragnarok when Hulk helps him out on that side quest before the end dives right directly into Infinity War. Where even the movies themselves showcase a point I brought out in Infinity War that all the heroes are separated into factions, either by movies or groups, and it's why Thanos' job was easy to accomplish. Just like how it was easy for this film to make $1.1 billion, the highest grossing film of 2016, and the second individual Marvel film to do so after Iron Man 3, who got barely beaten out by Frozen later that year. Where these films represented the high point of the MCU, where the individual types of films can do so well on their own despite their titles not being an Avengers-esque, with a net profit close to $200 million for Disney. So as we could see, this was the perfect breakup film for them. Focus on the past, present, and future of their relationships as heroes, the right thing to do and the wrong thing to do as divided they fell. And what I would like to do for this video is comment on the critical emotional moments of the characters that led them forward or backward in what they were trying to accomplish, what it means to be a hero from your own definition or those on Earth. Because a major factor in the Captain America films is the political aspect of them, in the thriller sense of what governments were doing from the United States to the United Nations in this film when they demanded to be put in check. The beginning of this film shows when they were on a mission to stop Crossbones, who happens to be Brock Rumlow, who formerly worked for Hydra under S.H.I.E.L.D.'s watch in the last film and got scarred and became this evil mercenary. How people feel about this is also a heavily debated topic that still plagues Marvel to this day, since he does die for the sake of the story very early on, where you see these huge villains of several characters or reformed ones or anti-heroes just die within their first film, like Crossbones and most recently the not so great Taskmaster in Thunderbolts, which is very upsetting because of how they don't stick to these characters that were important in the comics. Also, there is the other fact of other villains that were introduced with the year previously with those like Darren Cross and Ant-Man, and how in the next film he came back as MODOK, and that's just even more disappointing, and of course he dies in that film too. Just a problem that plagues Marvel in all aspects, where they introduce one villain and that villain no longer matters. But beside that topic we can debate about, the main point here is fighting these bigger villains as the Avengers Avengers team form at the age of Ultron and the consequences that come after that when Wanda saves Steve from Rumlow's suicide tactic to get him when he was talking about Bucky, which unfortunately destroyed a building where Wakandans were on a humanitarian mission inside that building. This event brought up an important conversation going in the political world with the international community's reaction to such events, and the previous one where chaos followed the Avengers' wake. This also followed the prologue scene of where Bucky was used as the Winter Soldier for special missions under Hydra or the Soviets back in 1991 to stop a car important to them, which happens to be revealed as Howard and Maria Stark later in the film, as we'll dive into that scene, before they left to whatever destination that they were going to, as shown in the presentation Tony did for MIT. And this is an important conversation to showcase that this isn't just a solo Captain America story, but a continuation of the Avenger leaders as a whole, with Tony's relationship, whether it be with his parents looking back on his memories of what he wished could happen, or the ones present like his break with Pepper. Again, that also still feeds into the breakup theme of this video, going into reality with the Avenger friends as discussed, or the relationships they had, with the conversation of a mother whose son died in Sokovia trying to help. Like at the very first moment, whether it be the actual battle with Steve or the private conversations with Tony, you see people blame them for their failures to avenge the ones they love. Once again, applying to that point I keep mentioning time and time again with these characters, starting with the Tony's original Avenger statement and why they fail later in Infinity War, because they do not become Avengers. It sets up this interesting argument about the role of the Avengers in a society, how people react to them existing and the damage it could potentially cause, hence why the political aspect of it plays into the film, at least in the international community sense that matters, which does translate over with projects like The Falcon and The Winter Soldier, which is all built upon one of my favorite Marvel films of all time, with the Winter Soldier itself and our flimsy trust in governments. And one of the big things that this film does is show you how both sides can be right and wrong on multiple occasions, that you could sympathize with their position easily, or you can decide who's actually right or not with the opinions of those like King T'Chaka or those like Secretary Ross, played by the late William Hurt, returning from the Incredible Hulk years ago, who sadly passed away a few years and would be eventually played by Harrison Ford in Brave New World to make amends with Sam. But the point of this is to stress how no matter what they do, people are always going to get hurt or killed, even if the event they are stopping is 10 times worse as a whole for the planet. Like in the smaller cases like this when they tried to stop Crossbones from stealing a bioweapon, where he happened to have something to try to stop them in a suicide mission with Steve, which unfortunately carried over to harm somebody else. Seeing every argument here that can be right where nobody actually comes out as an effective winner, especially operating on foreign soil with the way that this world works that mirrors reality itself.
What word would you use, Mr. Secretary?
How about dangerous? What would you call a group of US-based, enhanced individuals who routinely ignore sovereign borders and inflict their will wherever they choose, and who, frankly, seem unconcerned about what they leave behind?
And Ross's point about the team is correct from a certain point of view in the dangerous vigilantes who go from place to place stopping who they choose to stop, whether it be Hydra or villainous mercenaries around the world, where when you look at it from a political perspective, many people cannot handle that despite the public opinion that can hail them as superheroes from comic books. And in order to stop that, they must be checked upon with groups like the United Nations with the Sokovia Accords or retire as a hero group. This justification does relate to many real things we have when we have dangerous weapons like nukes or probably even AI when you think of its rapid new uses, where they need to be put in check before they do something wrong, like the screen showing the deaths of many individuals caused by their own actions. Where for the case of this footage, you can counter his arguments by saying what would have happened if it weren't for their actions, like Hydra killing 80 million people that would have been a threat to them, consisting of future heroes, Ultron's dropping a tiny nation to blow up the entire planet, or even fighting an alien invasion. What would have happened if the Avengers didn't step in? That this film consists of more than one fight, if it's from Ross's perspective, Tony and Steve's opinions on that matter, and the main villain being Zemo, the only one who never physically fights the Avengers and also wins, paving the way for Thanos. And because of that, Helmut Zemo should be considered as one of Marvel's best villains for his actions as a simple human being who hated superpowered beings for the same reasons the Sokovia Accords brought up with the damage that they caused behind the scenes, effectively working from behind the shadows to capture, torture, and kill his opponents for the information he desires and never gets caught until the very end of the film. That the main point point of this film is to showcase that all of these events rely on someone's perspective, whether they're right or not. A strong case for this regulation talk does happen to come from Vision, who sees the effects of what happened after Tony Stark became Iron Man. Of course, mainly in reference to the growing cinematic universe that started out with that first film, but also under the calculation that as their strength and heroics grow defeating other foes, bigger ones appear, which means more disasters regardless of the outcome, and spirals in a snowball effect that will always hurt the innocent. That these events should always be put into check from any harm, just as advocated by Tony Stark from his emotions, talking to a distraught mother who still blamed him for the death of her son.
Charlie didn't want to go to Vegas or Fort Lauderdale, which is what I would do. He didn't go to Paris or Amsterdam. Sounds fun. He decided to spend his summer building sustainable housing for the poor, guess where? Sokovia. He wanted to make a difference, I suppose. I mean, we won't know because we dropped a building on him while we were kicking ass.
Again, something that you could argue either way for the case of what would have happened if he wasn't there to stop what Ultron did. But then again, Ultron still is Tony's fault anyway. Yet on the other hand, for Steve, his fight is the belief that the safest hands are their own against the agenda by an international body of people, one that I believe also has not been very great in our own modern world with conflicts around the globe, which contributed to the reason from the start that I did side with Steve.
If we sign this, we surrender our right to choose. What if this panel sends us somewhere we don't think we should go? What if there's somewhere we need to go and they don't let us? We may not be perfect. The safest hands are still our own.
Because for his values, you just can't hand it over to governments who will fail to stop their own conflicts where they decide who can or cannot run things. If a threat appears, it is in their right to act on it or rely on a weak or human military to be simply outnumbered by powerful magical or special beings. And that is a choice that cannot be made by a hero. And stuff like that is the perfect reason why this has to be titled Civil War, considering that this is a Captain America film and the American Civil War that was largely based on the politics of slavery and what the North and South came into debate on, just like any other day and age with the two parties in American history coming into conflict, with, of course in the film, the two parties of Avengers in Marvel's American history. It's also solidified in their choices when you see the next scene deal with loss, the passing of Peggy that affects Steve, and then the bombing of Zemo to frame Bucky for the death of King T'Chaka, and then the introduction of T'Challa as the Black Panther, filled with vengeance, where Chadwick truly deserved more, with the death that still sadly lingers 5 years later. Yet with this new death, it sets up a different path for the ones that the government are trying to capture for, with Bucky now brought into the picture for what was apparently his bombing at the signing ceremony, feeling rageful actions for Black Panther to kill him, despite what actually happened. And it's a plot point that still sticks to the very end of the film with Tony, being consumed by hatred and vengeance for something not of their own accord. The fight between saving Bucky, Bucky himself, killing Bucky, and imprisoning Bucky that contributes to this scene, with Cap almost agreeing to sign on to the Accords, since at this point, most people can assume that a Bucky is under his responsibility or he will become a dangerous outlaw if he doesn't submit to otherwise, putting into perspective their final differences that could have been amended yet never was going to happen after he stated he put Wanda under supervision, which he disagrees out of care for her and how people like her react to the government, and how exactly you protect that. Simply, it becomes a matter of who you trust, trying to prevent supposed disaster that he had nightmares about, or the destruction of everything in Steve's mind for someone else's call. Bickering that only serves to help the villain in this situation, like Zemo, who managed to become the psychiatrist after killing the real one that helps Barnes, secretly having his ways to disable the power just to activate the Winter Soldier again. That once more, we see this villain who relies on his intellect to take down the Avengers, using information about Hydra and everyone else to get to this position rather than any brute force of action that they would do. A calculated figure that knows who to call on when it's necessary, causing this chaos that separates them once more, making Bucky remember Steve as they hide out from the chaos from those like Ross, furious at what happened and wanting them all to be captured because of their lives lost again to their actions. The main point drilled throughout is mostly on this issue of the unnecessary casualties, whether it be not their own fault or actually in a way their fault, and how they set them up on this hill to die on for no matter what people think, where for the teams to accomplish their goals, they must recruit newer heroes, including ones introduced in this film and of course older ones introduced in other films. Such examples include old favorites like Clint helping out Wanda, and also recruiting Ant-Man, and of course the introduction of Spider-Man to the MCU, the most heavily anticipated moment by far, with the newest introduction of Peter Parker, perhaps the youngest heroes by far compared to the other two who would eventually team up with him a few years later in one of the good films released in the past decade. This is something you could say is a positive thing for Civil War, where despite what happens to the Avengers, new heroes arise in the chaos as the world expands at a remarkably fast rate. Spider-Man's introduction in this film, and on Tony's side, perfectly fits for what kind of message they were going for, concealing himself as a hero for what he can do with the powers he has, instead of the typical story of how he got bit by a radioactive spider that the other two went for, because everyone is already familiar with that story and now we're trying to fit it in a larger world. That same sense can be applied to Scott Lang and his idolization of Captain America, just like Peter was in The Little Kid in Iron Man 2. The insects that join the other side based on their history, with Ant-Man of course being with a criminal background and then an aspiring genius looking up to Tony. That both insect-type heroes fit within the ideology that they're going for, with somehow Clint agreeing to take part of this for some reason just because he owed Cap a favor or something. Or also how you get Black Panther on their side because of this idea of vengeance to get Bucky, mainly still wanting to kill him, where his introduction as a character in the MCU is mostly of a prince getting used to becoming a leader in the world stage. Not ready for it yet, but trained to be a skilled warrior with the mantle of the Black Panther. And looking back on it now, you never realize how many heroes actually got their first starts in this film if you count those who started just before or were about to in films succeeding it. But anyways, for videos like this, I like to think that the battles are the least important moments of the film, where it's more of the heart-filled conversations that spark the greatest engagement, as that does what leads to civil wars in the first place. The bitter arguments of your fellow man, or friends in this case, where their division causes more damage than they could ever imagine, to the point of imprisoning those you consider friends until the finale shows that they are right in their convictions. This part is where most people believe that Zemo is planning to take down empires with just super soldiers like his stunt with Bucky, and how Tony now sees this and is willing to help to find the truth. The truth that Zemo never wanted to have an army and killed every super soldier in the ice because he despised them, as elaborated in the TV show, where his fight is with the idea that people can have power, like the Avengers themselves, people who think they're gods. They reveal to them that he's Sokovian, where his family, his wife and child, died when the Avengers were battling the city, and wants to see them all fall after studying them for a year. The efforts to get Barnes as the Winter Soldier out with the mission report back in 1991.
An empire toppled by its enemies can rise again, but one which crumbles from within, that's dead.
Now the reason I just highlighted this quote by Zemo is because it's very true in the most senses of the world when you study history. When you look at the fall of empires or national ideologies, countries can fall to their enemies but rebuild into something else, like back into what it once was in some way, but those torn apart on the inside, like revolutions, it can never fully recover, hence the emotional relationship between Stark and Rogers and how the night the Winter Soldier went out, revealing the mission relating to Howard and Maria, that he was responsible for it all under the brainwashing, and Steve actually knew about it before Tony saw the video himself. The process of where the real Civil War begins as the final breakup begins to unfold on screen for all of us to see. This is something you could say is the Act 2 of the debate, turning into vengeance for what happened a long time ago. We first dealt with the Sokovia Accords where nobody won on that issue, and it's now simply their relationships with each other as his family died, where you can understand he was brainwashed to do it, but also can't excuse Steve knowing he knew about it and not telling Tony soon enough to actually go on a rampage for killing his parents.
Did you know?
Yes.
Again, it's a fight you can clearly take either side for being right, for defending a friend, or knowing that his mom was killed unjustifiably by his actions. He's passionate about this, and you can see how much Tony cares about this, even going to state how much he valued that he was his friend when Steve defended Bucky for his actions.
He's my friend.
So was I.
As much as I sided with Cap for the Sokovia Accords, I actually couldn't defend some of what he did to not help Tony sooner. And the same can be said for Tony just going full out against a non-brainwashed Bucky at this moment, even though that's literally what I would do in that position filled with rage, since he killed his mom. And he did love his mom, so he can do what he feels is right. There are so many ways you could see and understand what they're doing, where it's nothing but heartbreaking to see them fight like bitter enemies over this argument by a guy who also lost his family. The biggest point of this film that makes Black Panther a true hero in his own right, watching from the shadows of what Zemo did and his own history, that he finally saw who killed his father, but also realized in this moment that he could not go through with what they're doing right now, because for the most part, as we realize, he simply went down the rageful path and wanted to kill Bucky, which Tony is actually doing right now until he realized that letting that consume him means he'd be lost forever.
Vengeance has consumed you. It's consuming them.
I'm done letting it consume me.
Where when you look at his own journey with Black Panther in the film that succeeded it, you see how this is meant to shape him to be a king, a real leader even better than what his father did for Wakanda and for the world, where you can't let people dictate what happens in your life, whether it be the United Nations or your past regrets. That is the path down to darkness, where you just need to move forward and forgive those against you. Otherwise, bad things happen, just like what happened in Infinity War. That the most noble thing to do is to spare the villain like Zemo, who tried to shoot himself but became useful to the living later on, and however many Disney Plus shows they may want. But sparing him also ensured that he did not have a full-on victory, because unlike Thanos in my opinion, who rested on a grateful universe, Zemo had to live with the consequences of his actions. To stay alive over the years where the Avengers, no matter what this event did, would have to be together again, as we saw by Endgame, to make amends as friends and save the day. Where Steve always valued that relationship, where not everything is lost, sending that cell phone in case that they needed help. The right actions that needed to be done, where they're secretly there for each other even though this fight broke their relationship for the time being. The sad fate for now, where he has to drop the shield at Tony's bitter request of it belonging to his father and not him. A proof, in my opinion, of how he's worthy because he gave up the thing that made him Cap just for Tony. Or whatever you could think of this ending in this film, that proved how you can successfully break the powerful gods known as the Avengers into nothing, where when the time is right, they would lose. And unfortunately, not lose together like Cap promised, until they were able to get over their past traumas and become the Avengers once again, as the definition describes them. Where Civil War was a great exercise in breaking the unbreakable spirit, where politics of any kind will eventually ruin our personal relationships with each other for the greater good, and how the world cannot be trusted to do the right things with its own agenda. When it came out back in 2016, it was really a spectacular sight to see, mostly on the fact of our heroes fighting each other, with friend against friend, just as our own Civil War had brother against brother, showcasing their abilities head on, but also just a sad story where we can get torn by simple opinions for better or worse. Mostly worse since Infinity War happened, of course. That this film succeeded in showcasing how being a hero is not an easy task, and that we can see they can lose more than once, and how they unfortunately got other people involved into something so trivial, and why the world realizes that they need them to do what is necessary when the time calls for it. The vision is simply never the answer, where nobody comes out on top, even one human villain who did more damage than any other powerful being ever could imagine. And it's thanks to this story of the film, that united we stand and divided we fall. And that's all there is to say about this. I'm all done. Goodbye.